Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Eyes on Earth, a podcast produced at the USGS Aeros Center, which celebrates its 50th anniversary this year. Our podcast focuses on our ever-changing planet and on the people at Aeros and around the globe who use remote sensing to monitor the health of Earth. My name is Jane Lawson, and I'll be hosting today's episode, where we're peering ahead into the future at Aeros while marking a half-century of achievements. Many exciting developments lie ahead. For example, Landsat Next, the planned successor to the Landsat 9 satellite, promises to extend the 51-year-old program's continuity and the archive at Aeros into at least the 2030s with innovative improvements. In the shorter term, the next generation of land cover and land use projects at Aeros is on the horizon. Our guest today is Dr. Pete Doucette, who was named the director of Aeros this past March. Pete moved here in 2019 from the USGS in Reston, Virginia, to fill the role of Integrated Science and Applications Branch Chief at Aeros, and in 2021 he was named Acting Center Director. Pete's background in applied science and land imaging suited him well for the move to Aeros, where he looks ahead by embracing concepts like the merging of science and technology with artificial intelligence and machine learning. Welcome, Pete, to Eyes on Earth.
Thank you, Jane.
First, let's reflect for a moment about the past 50 years for Aeros. What did you think of as the legacy of Aeros when you came here and added to the center's history?
Well, I guess Landsat would be the obvious first answer, but I think it's much more than that. And so the real legacy of Aeros to me has been the advancing of the state-of-the-art of land remote sensing, right, from a civilian use perspective, especially in applications related to land change science, which it helped create. I think we put that science on the map, in a manner of speaking. So I think Landsat did a great job of laying the foundation for that broader enterprise of remote sensing, which is what making the availability of spaceborne multispectral imagery data a reality for civilian use. So in so doing, we went from being essentially a data repository for Landsat, going back to the early 70s, to today an end-to-end remote sensing center, where we operate the satellites, manage the data, and exploit the data by making derived products for the community. And that, to me, is the real legacy of Aeros.
We added science to the formula.
Adding remote sensing and land change science.
Can you name any moments in Aeros' past that you wish you would have witnessed?
So that's an interesting question. And as you stated up front, I've only been here for a few years, and there's all kinds of history that I've heard of, a lot of interesting history. But I would have to say probably the changing of the data policy to a free and open data policy, because to me that was a significant event. I mean, it was kind of the second revolution of Aeros, if you will, to help put Aeros on the map by making the data available free and open to the public, because it opened up a new marketplace for remote sensing, and it set the standard and a precedent for some other federal providers for remote sensing data. And so at that time, the views were very passionate on both sides before we actually committed to that decision. And a lot of pros and cons were discussed, and folks were quite energetic about their views. So I think it would have been interesting to be part of that debate, because I tend to I mean, there's an entertainment factor and there's a learning factor when folks are that passionate about their views, and I kind of feel that's my personality as well. I tend to be passionate when I feel strongly about something. So it would have been interesting being part of that debate.
What did you anticipate for Aeros and your role when you arrived in 2019?
I believed at the time, and I think it's probably still true, that I was brought in to maybe shake things up a little bit, both from in terms of the culture and maybe transitioning to newer technologies. And by those, I mean, largely the cloud, commercial cloud, and artificial intelligence in that order. And so there was maybe some reassessing of risk that needed to occur. And of course, there's always risk with changing direction. And you always have to compare something with something else. So there's risk in changing direction, just as there's risk with staying with the status quo. Perspectives will vary, and I've witnessed just how much they can vary on what is considered too much risk. So that's where applying some kind of judgment is needed, and making those judgments with confidence makes all the difference to getting folks on board with a new direction. So I think my main role now, being the director of the center, there's the management function, which everybody's familiar with what that is in large part, but then the leadership part, I think, can be boiled down to a simple idea, which is to foresee the inevitable and then to accelerate its adoption in the workforce or in the workplace. And that's taken from a quote that goes back to the 18th century. But it sounds nice to be able to foresee the inevitable, but that's what I thought, at least for the last 5 to 10 years. I thought that moving to cloud was inevitable, and I didn't have any special clairvoyance, as to why I thought that. It was largely just based on having good external awareness. And so I guess kind of coming in from the outside, even though I wasn't coming in completely from the outside, I started my career at USGS with the National Land Imaging Program in Reston. And so I certainly understood, had a reasonable understanding of how AROS worked. So walking in with that information and having some external awareness of kind of where things were headed, I thought that cloud was inevitable. And there were some concerns early on, and I expected that. But I think we're making nice progress in the direction of cloud. And I think AI is the next big technology front, if you will, that we're starting to get into.
Do you want to elaborate just where we are with the cloud adoption here?
So all of the Landsat archive has been migrated to cloud. And we have been, as one example, another example is we've been hosting data for NASA for a number of years through the DAC. And much of that, NASA's made the decision to move. They actually have 12 DACs that they fund across the country, and our LP DAC, the Land Processes DAC, is the one that we service for them. So NASA's made the decision to migrate all of 12 DACs to the cloud, and so that includes the LP DAC, and a big chunk of it has already migrated. And I would expect the Land Processes DAC to have completed that process probably in the next couple of years. So those are two very high-profile examples of, I think, the progress that we've made going to cloud.
How have your expectations changed, and what transformations at AROS do you anticipate in the future?
So my expectations have not changed in terms of transitioning to new technologies. And as I said earlier, I think we're making some nice progress in that direction. However, in regards to changes with culture, so one of the realities that has really set in just in the last couple of years is the challenges we're going to have from a recruitment and retention perspective, and the realities of the HR process. So those are going to cause us to be much more creative as to how we retain and recruit the next generation, which is a key part of always keeping your culture on the cutting edge, especially when it comes to technology. And there are a variety of ways that have been discussed as to how we might do that. Allowing more remote work, kind of, for example. But so that expectation has probably changed just in the last few years, just recognizing how challenging it's going to be.
What excites you most when you think about the future of AROS?
What excites me most is in regards to the new technologies. And so it's difficult to attend just about any conference these days without AI being discussed, in some form or fashion. And I studied neural networks, which is kind of the foundation of AI these days through deep learning. I studied neural nets back in the 90s. And neural networks have kind of gone through some highs and lows over the last 50 years. And after I finished some graduate study in the late 90s that was based on neural networks, I was advised I should probably get into a different area because they were just not they were not being favored at that time. Funding was being pulled because they just hadn't demonstrated their utility. And so I think it was believed it was a bit of a I wouldn't say pseudoscience, but certainly not demonstrated science. And so that's what I did. I went into other areas, only to see around 2010 a resurgence in neural nets that became deep learning and is now the new AI, right? So I kind of feel like I got cheated out of my chance to actually practice that the way I see it being done today. And so I have no doubt that within the next decade here, I think a large part of what we do is going to start taking advantage of AI methods, and it'll be fun to see it from the level of the director. But it would have been nice to have my hands in the middle of that, as a researcher. But so I envy those who will have that opportunity.
So you were a researcher ahead of your time.
I was. Again, it's easy to say that I foresaw the inevitable, but I really didn't, because it wasn't clear back in the 90s that AI was going to take off the way it did.
What key point would you like the public to understand about EROS?
How about understanding what we actually do? I think, and that's often misunderstood, or at least we can maybe do a better job of trying to explain it. It's complicated what we do, but if we can do it at a more fundamental level, which is essentially to monitor and understand the planet's changing landscape, right? I mean, there's a lot that goes into saying that. So one way to think about it is look at how we manage and monitor our own personalized landscapes, for example, our own property. Some of us invest a lot of money in monitoring and watering and fertilizing, for example, a lawn, because it's important to us. It's our personalized natural resource, if you will. And so that is kind of what we're doing from a remote sensing perspective on a global scale. And so it's important that we understand how the landscape on a global scale is changing, because ultimately it affects how we're going to live our lives and protect what's important to us. In our lifetimes, remote sensing has revealed a world shaped by forces that are way more dynamic and intertwined than we ever could have imagined before observing it from space. And so we're able to do this largely these days because of being able to see the invisible, in a manner of speaking, right? Different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum beyond the visible, for example, the infrared and the thermal. And we're able to observe those kinds of phenomena as they reflect in those parts of the EM spectrum across broader or longer periods of time, years to decades. So we're able to observe how these changes manifest. We weren't able to do that 50 years ago, and so that's become of vital importance as to how we are managing the health of the planet.
Do you have a message for EROS staff as we mark this half-century anniversary?
Yeah, I'd say that so Landsat is obviously tied to the success of EROS, and it really defines us. And we just celebrated Landsat's 50th last year. And I made a comment at one of the speeches last year that I thought Landsat was really a great, it's more than just a 50-year story. It's a great American story. I like to compare it with another great American story, which is the Lewis and Clark expedition, where the American West was discovered, on behalf of the early settlers at that time. Of course, there were inhabitants in the West at that time, but so what Lewis and Clark did for the early American settlers in discovering the West is what Landsat did, I think, for the planet in its early days, and that's not overstating it. And it's more than an American story. It's a story that's gone global. So it's a story that's worth telling, and one that we should take a lot of pride in and kind of bask in the moment. After 50 years, I think we've earned it.
Any closing thoughts about what EROS has to look forward to in the next 50 years?
The next 50 years is what I often prefer to talk about, or at least the next decade. So keep the fire burning. We all know that change is inevitable, and whether we we welcome it or not, we all know we have to adapt to it. But being more adaptable to change, and it's probably going to, we witnessed a ton of change over the last 50 years, but I would speculate that it's probably going to be even more rapid as we go into the cloud and start understanding how to use AI better. So I think the more of an adaptability mindset that we have, hopefully the easier it should be to adapt to the change. It's never easy, and it involves the risks I talked about earlier. But it's always easy to say to try to be adaptable to change. But I think we'll be better off for it.
Thank you, Pete, for joining us for this episode of Eyes on Earth, where we caught a glimpse into the future of Aeros.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some of these remarks with the workforce.
And thank you to the listeners. Check out our Aeros Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to watch for our newest episodes. And you can also subscribe to us on Apple and Google Podcasts.
This podcast
is a product of the U.S. Geological Survey, Department of Interior.